Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Our first recording for 2026. I have a sense that this year is going to be a full-on year and a year that involves a lot of change. And what better way to kind of ease into that or lean into that than to be talking about something that I think is going to show up everywhere, which is how we make stuff. And we're talking today to Jason Rolland from Carbon Inc. So firstly, Jason, before we dive into the topic, before we go straight into the problem space like we typically do, just give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you came to be working on this problem of how we make stuff better than we do today.
Yeah, happy to. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So my background is in chemistry and specifically in polymer chemistry. And so that kind of stemmed out of just a general interest in science as a kid and then specifically falling in love with chemistry in high school, and then in college sort of discovering organic chemistry and really enjoying that whole field. And then really kind of looking at a branch in the road between pharma and material science. And I did my undergraduate work at Virginia Tech, and which happened to be a powerhouse of polymer chemistry, certainly now and at the time when I was there. And so really just fell in love with this ability to, through chemistry and through this very specific set of reactions and platform, that you can make these materials that impact all kinds of different industries and different aspects of things, from medical devices to sports equipment to, biopolymers and drug delivery and all these types of things. So really just fell in love with the field and decided that's what I wanted to do. And then I pursued a PhD at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill under Joe DeSimone, who's also a founder of Carbon. Just really continued this excitement about polymer chemistry. And through Joe, I actually was introduced to entrepreneurship and how that can fit in everything, and how it can be a really great vehicle to get technologies out into the world where they're actually having an impact. I could pause there, but that was sort of the
that story. Because I don't want to date you, but you've been in the PhD was a while back. I want to just general, how's the space evolved? How are people thinking about polymers and using chemical properties of materials to create new materials or create new ways of creating materials? Like just purely the science level before we dive into some of the actual mechanics and the reality inside carbon. Like how has that changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of branches to that tree of how things have evolved and changed. Certainly, people are circularity and recycling and new approaches, new materials that are able to go back to building blocks and that kind of thing. And the sustainable bio-based polymers, that's been a huge emerging field. 3D printing, of course, has been a very large impact in terms of using polymers to make objects, and what types of objects you can make, what types of materials you can put into a 3D printer. I'd say that's been a huge thread. There's been a lot of exciting work in drug delivery and medical devices and bioabsorbable, resorbable polymers within the body. So there's many branches to that tree. Again, part of what it drew me to it is that there's just so many different things you can do from this core science. And 3D printing is sort of the ultimate realization of that, because you have these machines and software and material systems all working together to generate parts. And, it just, the number of industries that we can impact is enormous. And that's part of what's great about being at Carbon.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for those of people who are listening rather than watching this, because we're on both now, sitting behind you is a bunch of, quote unquote products. Just as a starting point for kind of getting into how the world works today en masse rather than how it looks at carbon. Just let's walk through some of the products that are in the background behind you and understand what it looks like today to manufacture those products if you're going down a more traditional manufacturing process, both from a material perspective and from a kind of, I guess, process / economic perspective.
Yeah, that's is a great question. I'm trying to wrap my head around how to answer that. So I think in terms of the competing materials that we think a lot about, I would say there's mainly two big categories. One would be in the area of foams, elastomeric foams. And the way that currently works, you would make foam at a massively large scale. It is typically chopped into pieces and shapes, or molded or created, foamed within a mold, as is in the case with car seats or something like that. But there's a lot of waste in that process, and there's a lot of reasons why there are limitations to the types of products you can make from that main foaming process. On the plus side, however, it is very, very cheap to make foam and to do so at a very large scale. And so that's often something that we're bumping up against. And, one of the things that 3D printing, I think, has grown out of is it's no longer okay for something. It's cool just because it's 3D printed. It actually has to serve a function and do something better. And so foams are something that we think about a lot. We think about how can we outperform a foam and what types of products do we think we can manufacture that have a benefit to the end user over foam. So that would be one big category, and happy to go into more of that. The second category would be in the area of injection molded plastics. And so this has been around for many decades, and it's a fantastic technology for a lot of different things, especially if you're going into very high volume production where cost is everything. A lot of these materials have been developed over many decades. They're fairly standardized. And so, how this all works, you generally have factories that are largely, in Asia, and these would be, in either case of what I just spelled out, either injection molding factories or factories that are processing foams. They would source raw materials from all over the globe. Those materials then arrive at a factory. There is typically tooling involved that has the shape of whatever you're trying to make. The plastic pellets or foam reagents go in, and out comes your part. And then those parts are made at typically a very, very large scale, and they go, either to the next stage of manufacturing where they're assembled into a final product, and then, shipped all over the world, kind of thing. So does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, and I guess the thing that I always want to understand about the status quo is, like, it sounds like it does an incredible job of delivering on the cost side of the equation. I'm trying to understand what's wrong with the picture. Like what's wrong with the way we're doing things today? If it's winning on cost, what else? What are the side effects or the other problems with this?
Yeah, great question. So, I often view this as it's not a either or type of thing, and I don't think that there's a world where 3D printing just completely, puts to bed injection molding or foam processing. I think that there's a lot of room for both. But to answer your question, what's wrong with that? I think, what's wrong with that is that in many cases, you're able to make a much better, superior product for the end user using 3D printing. And so, for example, just jumping back to foams, one of the things that we've been working on for over a decade at this point is in the space of elastomers. And so this would be things like polyurethane rubbers or other types of stretchy materials. So my team on the materials side has spent a lot of time over the years developing various iterations of polyurethane elastomers, high performance products that are useful in sports equipment and running shoes and these types of things. And what's exciting about that is again, 3D printing it's often viewed as just the machine and the printer, but it's a combination of the hardware, the software, and the material side. And I always like to think of it as the most important thing is the part that's coming out of the printer. Nobody actually cares about all the cool tech that's behind all of it. They care about the part. I care for sure, yeah. But, they care about the part that comes out of it. Does it do what I need it to do?
Sure.
And so, within 3D printing, there's a type of structure that can only be made with additive manufacturing, and that's these lattice type structures. And so, actually, I grab one from the desk here, if you don't mind. Yeah, so you have a structure like this that's a lattice structure. And you have different size struts and these things like that. But this is a type of geometry that can really only be made with additive manufacturing. And so why does that matter? Well, if you can digitally with software, begin to make these types of structures and fine tune these types of structures for specific applications, that you can start to do a lot of cool things that you can't do with foams. So one example would be, in something like a bike saddle, which is a big business for us. You don't want the same level of cushioning on all parts of that bike saddle. You sort of want some regions of it to be stiffer, some regions of it to be softer. The same would be true for a running shoe. And in order to do that with foams, you actually have to have different types of foams within the product. And if you tear open the cover off of a typical bike saddle, that's what you'll see. You'll see different types of foams kind of taped together. What you can do with something like this is that I can, just by changing the geometry, I can intrinsically have stiffer regions and softer regions within the part. And so you start to have these design freedoms and these interesting features that you've just never been able to even think about before with the traditional manufacturing methods and materials. So that's one thing. The second piece is breathability. So you think about foams are really good at trapping heat and trapping moisture. Something like this is a very open structure. Even though it's providing the same level of cushioning and impact protection, it's a very breathable open structure. And that matters in something like a football helmet, for example. Another area that recently we've been really excited about and working with some of the biggest players in this space is in wheelchair cushions. And so that's another area where you have the state of the art in foams, and it works okay. But there are many problems. There are many problems with people having pressure sores from being in a wheelchair for very long periods of time. And that is a direct result of managing pressure, heat, and moisture. And so we've had really, really positive feedback from wheelchair cushions made with structures that look like this, that are still soft and comfortable, but they're very breathable. And the third thing I'll just point out, and then we can let you respond. But the third thing is around customization. And so there are a lot of products that actually would perform better for the end user if they were custom, either to that person's, the particular shape of somebody's head in a football helmet, for example, or even just these lattice structures, if I could tailor the regions of stiffness and softness within the part for a person's, a particular person's body. And so this whole area of customization, and that can get into medical devices, it can get into consumer products. That's something that's very, very difficult to do at scale with traditional manufacturing means. And so sort of those are three big reasons why the traditional methods fall short in a lot of different products.
Got it. And I don't want to kind of position this and project this if it's not true, but when I think a lot about what makes a product better longer term, everything you've just talked about are essentially performance parameters of a product, right? Is it weight, its breathability, its ability to remove moisture or be soft in the right areas. So these are all related to performance. Therefore, they're showing up, to your point, in sporting examples and in health
Correct.
examples where performance and fit for the individual, not just, hey, the average person needs this. I'm assuming you've read that book about averages. It's not a big book, but it talks about why we're wrong about averages and where it's all going, and like why we should run away from averages.
Yeah, I've heard about this. Yeah,
I'll link
I haven't
it in the
read
notes.
it.
It's super good. Just as a slight tangent, it talks about how when they first built planes, 1 in 5 pilots basically were crashing, and they tried to find the average pilot so that they could make a cockpit for the average pilot. and all of them, no one was the average, right? It just didn't work. And they worked out that they
Yeah.
had to make cockpits configurable for the guy with big torso, short arms, long arms, long, so that was actually the unlock for them. So clearly, where there's a performance aspect, this stuff's amazing because you can dial it in down to an individual level, and you can do things that geometry-wise wouldn't be possible with a monolithic material. But if I think about the other aspect of what makes a product great, is its durability. And I wonder whether when you start being able to, on those three pillars you spoke about, the materials and the chemical that are being used to produce the polymers, are you shifting the dial on the durability of a product?
Yeah, Greg, I love that framework of averages. I might use that because we used to talk about, you don't, just think about earbuds, for example. You sort of accept whatever a company sends you, and it sort of shove it into your ear, and it's good enough. But that's an average, like, right? That someone decided that the average, ear canal is this diameter, and so we're going to make something that maybe you have, two or three choices that you can sort of fit in. But what you really want is a size Vincent earbud, right? Like you want something that's perfect and fits right into your ear. And then you can start to really get into interesting ideas around, medical devices and stents and things that, those are selected sort of like shoe sizes, and and there, you can imagine a future where they're not, where they're, you have an implantable device that's specific to your particular condition. So yeah, I really like that framing. On durability, it's a really important question because part of what has differentiated Carbon really from the beginning, our mission was how can we make 3D printing a true manufacturing technology and not just a prototyping technology, where it's been for many decades. 3D printing isn't new. It was, the early 3D printers were coming out in the 80s, but they were largely under this phrase rapid prototyping. And so we, from the beginning, wanted to make, how do you make end-use parts that are useful in a wide range of industries? And the question you're asking was front and center, is like, well, we need to make much better materials if we're going to do that. And that's where some of the innovations from my team have played a really big role, because we have taken a very different approach to the chemistry, which I'm happy to get into the details on. But that has allowed us to get to end state polymers that behave very similar to injection molded thermoplastics. And the initial partnership that we had that sort of put us on the map was to make running sneakers with Adidas. And that was very serious, and they have very serious demands and requirements for the performance of a running sneaker. And they have various tests that they put things through, and torture tests that they put things through, and then they will put on the shoes on athletes that will put hundreds of kilometers on them, and you can't have it fall apart, and so they have very strict demands for that. So we had to think very hard about, how do we get, in a very clever way, how do we get to polymers in the end state of the part that behave just as well as the traditional foams or whatever materials that people would be using from other processes.
Yeah. And I imagine you could go further than that as well. Like if I think about, if you're obviously there's some limitation in the chemistry because you have to take an additive process to actually producing the thing. So it has to work within that construct. But
that's right.
You probably have a lot more avenues that you can go down, and you can go down them incrementally. You can say, well, let's try this different chain. I don't understand the chemistry, obviously, but you can try one step removed chain and say, actually, this increased the durability of this product or its ability to not warp under heat or whatever the thing is by a factor of 20%. But we didn't have to completely retool the whole thing to work that out or to prove that was true when the models told us that would be true. Is that how you kind of approach that third pillar?
Yeah, I always draw the analogy of like a Rubik's Cube when trying to solve a material formulation problem, that you're always trying to solve for, a dozen different requirements, including that it has to work on the printer, right? That it has to have the right viscosity and, cure speed and all of that. But it is a complex set of requirements that you're trying to solve for. And very often they're at odds with each other, that if I, want to make it softer, then something else is maybe my toughness is going to suffer. And so you have all these trade-offs, and we use software tools, and I have a lot of really brilliant people that we've kind of figured out how to approach this process. But yeah, you're trying a lot of different formulation components. We use software tools, in mixture design, design of experiments type of things that allow you to find the optimal solution that is sort of gets you as close as you can to hitting all the properties that you need to. And so, yeah, there's what I like about the liquid chemistry, which is the type of 3D printer that Carbon makes. We use this liquid chemistry that is cured by UV light. There's a lot of formulation options to try. And, again, we've taken a different approach where we have both UV curable and thermally curable chemistry within the formulation. And that is ultimately what allows us to get to these really impressive final properties that give us things like great durability and, compression set and tear strength and all these things that we think about.
Yeah. And then again, like my understanding, within Carbon, you're quite specifically focused on these types of plastics and polymers, I think would be correct. Like there's a whole school of 3D printing and additive, manufacturing that sort of produce metal or metal type objects. But is it a moot point? Do you end up in a place where some of the chemical properties or not the chemical properties, but the physical properties of a polymer are actually going to be aligned to? I mean, this is a 3D printed titanium belt buckle. It amazes me that someone's printed this in titanium in 3D, and this was a couple of years ago. This is 2 years old.
Yeah.
And it's got some interesting geometry, and it blows me away that it's possible. And I explored whether we could do this in plastic, and the concerns weren't that they couldn't do it in plastic. They could absolutely get it to the same tolerances, the same strength, but it was more, would a person who accepts a metal belt buckle accept a quote-unquote plastic buckle because it's not as heavy or whatever? Like, do you find yourself leaning into that, or it's like we kind of swim in this lane where those types of challenges aren't our purvey?
Yeah. It depends on the part, honestly. If it's something like a belt buckle, then sure, yeah, I think you could make a case. Here's a plastic belt buckle that is tough enough, and it comes in different colors, and you have other aspects. This happened in the automotive industry where cars used to be entirely made of metal parts, and then slowly over the past few decades, and especially with electric cars where weight matters for everything, you see more and more of those metal parts being replaced by high performance polymeric parts, and weight and fuel economy was a real big driver for that. But there are certain things like airplane engine components that just have to be made of metal. And, so I think, again, there's a lot of space here. There's a lot of room for different manufacturing technologies. And there are some things where plastics cannot compete with metal, and there are other things where they can. And so it just depends on the part. For sure.
And it sounds like that Venn diagram is getting more and more overlapped when people are like, well, how much of this is just I'm used to this being metal, and in fact, if it was plastic, I mean, I've got a 71 Charger, like a Dodge Charger sitting in the driveway. It's entirely made out of metal,
Right.
There's a certain aesthetic beauty to that, and joy that comes from knowing you're in 4 tons of steel that gets 1 mile to the gallon or whatever you guys use over there. However, no one in their right mind today would buy a car that was completely metal, to use your example. And so it's like, what's driving that? Is it the materials are driving that, or the designers and the people who are manufacturing the products are driving it, or trends are driving it, or economics?
Yeah, I mean, I would say general trends, it's very likely driven by cost and fuel economy. No matter what you're talking about, whether it's an airplane or a car or a train, the lighter you can make that vehicle and still have it perform, the better everything is going to be. So I think that's largely been the driver. But yeah, I mean, I think, and then there's in between things too, where you can have, we've played around with this a bit, where you can have metal plated polymer parts. And so you have a polymeric object with maybe, a couple hundred microns of metal plated onto it. That has very interesting properties. Now you have the conductivity of metal, you have, improved mechanical properties, but it's using way less metal than if you were to just, mold the entire part type of thing.
Interesting. And that changes the economics of making the product potentially because you're not
It does.
using metal.
It would make it more expensive than if it was just the polymeric part, but perhaps less expensive than if you were trying to make it entirely out of metal.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so coming back kind of to carbon ink and where you guys are sitting, you said something before that I found like the lovely way to sort of think about how to think about carbon ink, which was that traditionally people have thought of 3D printing as a kind of a design prototyping part in a larger process that ultimately ends up back in, injection molded foam, blah, 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 whatever. And what the real push here with carbon ink, and I guess the industry more broadly, but you guys kind of at the tip of that, is this idea that there is a whole category of products that will be better in whatever version of you want to say, if they're actually made entirely using 3D printing in this context. So the question I've got is, help us understand like a broad spectrum of some of those products. You've given a couple of examples already, and there's obviously a shit ton sitting behind you. Pardon my French. But I want to understand not just examples of the products, but more how those products find their way to you. Are you having to go out to try to find people and say, hey, you should rethink this? Or are people saying, hey, we want an edge, we want to, what's driving the boat there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say we have a couple of different industries that we play in, and then we have areas where we think there will eventually be something and that we're keeping a close eye on. But at Carbon in particular right now, we have a large effort on consumer products and really exploiting the beneficial properties of these elastomer lattices over foams in a wide variety of products, whether that's, football helmets, hockey helmets. You see one of those up there, running sneakers or footwear of all kinds, bike saddles, wheelchair cushions, and seating. And so there's more than enough work. There's many, many years of work just within foam replacement and that type of thing. And again, when you have a platform technology like this, you are generally spending your first few years experimenting, and then hopefully, as was our case, you find something that really hits, and then you can sort of make iterations from there, right? So when we started the initial effort with Adidas, now we know how to make lattice type cushion products of a certain dimension with certain material properties. It's not that far of a stretch once you have that to then, okay, well, if I can make that, then I can make football helmet padding, and maybe I need a slightly different material and I need different geometries. And so these things start to cascade where once you knock a couple of these products out, and then you get well known. Oh, wow, I saw that Adidas shoe. Like, oh, I make this type of product, and, I think you might be able to help me. So that's a big area of focus for us. We have also a very large business within oral health and dentistry. And so that's a wide range of products, all the way from orthodontic aligners to dentures to night guards, and even just to simple dental models that dentists will use to fit a crown or a bridge. And their the entire reason for 3D printing within that industry is this idea of customization. And in many ways, the dental industry is ahead of other industries in terms of thinking about 3D printing and customization and doing that at a massive scale. So some of these orthodontic appliance companies that we work with, they make millions of parts per month that every single one of them is custom.
Wow.
There's very few examples of other industries that are that far along in thinking about customization. And so, again, one of my favorite things about Carbon and about 3D printing in general is just the different types of industries that you can get into is just astonishing. So those are the two big focal points for us right now. We also have some really interesting things happening on the defense side, where we've also created really great high temperature, high stiffness, high toughness polymers. And finding areas within the defense space around applying those types of things. Other spaces where we see potential, but there's just legacy technology and things that need to be worked through is in automotive. I think there's a lot of opportunities, but really, how I like to think about it is wherever you have a geometry that can only be made by 3D printing for one reason or another. Maybe it's something like this lattice structure that, physically can only be made this way, or maybe it's a million custom dental parts where trying to imagine doing that in molds is just a nightmare. Wherever you have that, and then plus a combination of high performance materials, that's where I think there's a space open for 3D printing and for our variation of 3D printing in particular.
Yeah,
so that seems to be.
I want to pull on that thread for a little bit actually, because I think, and I for forever I looked at, and I'm using air quotes, but I looked at the fashion industry and just went, ugh. And then I remember reading an article with a former head of government in Australia who had got involved in the fashion industry in Perth, which is like one of the most isolated capital cities in the world. Like, it's not Milan, put it that way, right?
Yeah.
And it was totally unrelated to, in some context, in some article, she basically said, well, we all wear clothes. And I was like, holy shit, I've totally missed the wood for the trees on this. And so there's this category of, quote unquote fashion, but just really think about it in terms of we have to eat and we have to be clothed and we have to be in houses. These things are unavoidable as long as the species is here. And if you sort of assume that baseline and then say to an individual rational consumer, would you prefer to have a generic product or a customized product? Then overwhelmingly they're going to say, well, I want the exact thing I want, the thickness or the height or the color or whatever the thing is that will make the product work better for them or better suit them, or just be like, I don't want the one that everyone else is wearing, like whatever the motivations are. So,
that's right.
In a world where, every rational consumer, whether they're in fashion or whether it's in a physical good or a car or whatever the stuff is, my guess is that the macro trend is towards, I want to be able to customize it. And in that world, a brand or a manufacturer who says, well, we're going to make insert product name X customizable, they will have a competitive advantage, even if they're a more costly product potentially. And my question, I guess, around durability was kind of threading the needle on, well, if something's highly durable, you will pay $400 for a thing that costs $100 because it's going to last 4 times as long as the economics work for the company as well. Is that kind of the world we're moving into? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And also just being able to, so in fashion and in apparel and these industries and in footwear, people get bored really fast, right? And so there's always something, you have an exciting foam technology or exciting new shoe design, and people go and buy it and they like it, and then it sort of fades away, and then you need to, okay, what's the next thing? What are you going to do for me next? And another big thing that we haven't quite talked about much, that 3D printing brings is flexibility in the manufacturing and the types of products. And so you can imagine, for if every part around you requires some kind of tooling, and that tooling takes, can sometimes take months. It can be very expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars to make a tool. You're going to run that as long as you can, and changing that becomes very difficult because you made this investment, you've done your optimization. Okay, now we go to production. Don't change it. Keep using that tool. Well, now you have a completely digital manufacturing platform where you can make changes every season. You can put out new designs, new geometries, all these things. So I do think there's a very big place for this technology to play in apparel and footwear and these types of industries. Both because of there are performance advantages, but also just because these companies can keep up faster and they can iterate on designs much faster than if they were using traditional manufacturing methods. And then you have this opportunity for customization, personalization. So I think it all kind of fits together.
Yeah, I mean, like I have so many questions. I guess the main thread of the question that I'm kind of interested in sort of pulling in, I think your term of the word apparel is good because it gets it away from fashion. It's just stuff that we wear on our feet, on our clothes, on our bodies or whatever. Is there an element here of the way that we produce these types of products, whether it's an apparel product or a fashion product, but other, disposable product? Here's a case that some headphones came in. This company probably in China is making 1 million of these at a time, but they make it, they create the thing that creates it, being the injection mold, and then they print 1 million of them at once, and they have to, that's the product for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And so the corollary of that obviously is, well, the product innovation stops and has to happen on 2-year cycles or whatever the payback period is. But also they make 2 million of them. And their hope is they're going to sell it. And their economics are so good, they can make 2 million and sell a quarter of that, which is essentially
Yeah.
the fast fashion model as well. And it doesn't matter because they can just handle the wastage. It just goes somewhere. And so there's an environmental impact of not being able to adopt this more cyclical, more just in time and produce what you need. And then when you don't need it, stop producing it and produce the new thing. Was that true, or is that kind of where it's going?
Yeah, we've had footwear companies tell us, I might be getting the quote wrong and I won't say which company, but basically it's like the success of their year is not on how many shoes they sell. It's how much inventory they have left over at the end of the year.
Wow.
Like, okay, then what do I have to do? Because then that goes to the secondary tiers and the distributors, and it eventually find a way out of it. But yeah, you have to make this prediction of how much do I make, and get as close as you can to the market demand, and then deal with whatever leftovers you have at the end of that. Whereas I do think that this technology does start to allow you to think about that a bit differently, that you can manufacture more on demand and you can change things, as when you want. You're not stuck with this tooling that you can't change, that you invested in and have to make some certain number of parts to recoup your costs.
Yeah.
And again, these things get very subtle and nuanced, that there are types of parts where it will always make sense to injection mold it. But there are a lot of parts where I think it is constricting in terms of innovation and the types of products that can be made.
Yeah. And I guess it depends, on the quantity of the product in the first place, but also whether that product is, or that part is fundamental to the experience of the product or just the capability of the product is most likely one of those levers. Just in terms of this kind of, and I'm kind of dragging myself back to the small amount of university college that I did, where we talked a lot about just-in-time inventory. What's the reality for someone? Let's take that helmet that's behind your right shoulder, I think, or left shoulder. I can't work out what the camera is. Like, how just-in-time is that? Like, if someone places an order on the website that, for the company that creates that helmet, when is it, or when will it be made? Like, what does that look like in a typical client for you guys?
Yeah, I would say that the benefit of our platform in that particular product isn't around the just-in-time manufacturing. It's around, we can make padding that outperforms traditional foam padding in every way, and they want the best for the players, and that's
Right.
all around this impact protection. We didn't talk much about that, but if you, through the combination again of materials and geometry, you can design, structures that maximize the amount of impact that can be absorbed, and diverted away from your head. With a foam, that you're limited in so how much you can do that. So for that particular product, I would say it fits more into a traditional supply chain type workflow, but instead of a foam producer, you have a 3D printing factory that's making pads. Those pads then go to a different, tier of manufacturing where they're assembled into the helmets. Now, there's an example I'll give that's fairly recent where, again, it's getting closer to that, but maybe not quite on demand. But there's a new product that was launched last year through Adidas called the Climacool shoe. And what's unique about this shoe is that it's fully 3D printed. I don't have one in this room, but so it's a fully 3D printed shoe. So when you buy, one part. So when you buy it, and actually there's a laced version and a not laced version. The not laced version is completely 3D printed. The laced version has shoelaces built into it that are not printed. But other than that, that's the shoe. And so it's fully printed, and this is something that they've made at a fairly decent scale. That is very interesting as just in terms of thinking about manufacturing in a product, because even a normal fashion shoe has a dozen or two different components that all need to be sourced and all need to be moved around the world and go to a factory and be stitched or glued and assembled. And there's a huge amount of labor, there's a huge amount of cost, and a huge amount of carbon footprint, all that goes into that. But if all of a sudden all you need is a you need the resin and you need a 3D printer, and you can make a finished pair of shoes. That's really interesting from just a supply chain perspective. And so that starts to get closer to, I think, sort of what you're getting at, is that how disruptive can this be? And so when you get to these fully 3D printed parts, or even just assemblies that would normally be 4 or 5 different things, but now it's just one thing, your supply chain is very different now, and in a good way.
Yeah, and it's good. Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say good segue to kind of where I think this is going. And it feels a little bit like fusion, which is it's always been 10 years away for a while. But in a world where you can 3D print a single product that is one single part, like a shoe, it's a great example, and that product performs as well, if not better, as the thing that it replaces. And it's available at a price point that is not dissimilar, so people aren't buying it for fad reasons or for whatever reasons. It's a true replacement to the product.
Yeah.
First, a couple of questions, and they're all kind of related, because I want to understand it in how the world might work, but also how it works at Carbon Inc. What does Adidas do? Do they hand to you and say, here's the design, refine it for us, and you manufacture it to them and hand it back to them, and then they deal with it from there? Or do they buy the machine from you, and then you, like, what is the model in which you do it? And then the second kind of related question is, how do they typically think to set that up? If they're going to sell that shoe globally, do they go like, well, we need 5 of these machines, we need them in the 5 major areas where we distribute from? Like, how do these things hang together?
Yeah, so the answer to that has evolved over time, but the basic structure we have right now is we have factories that are in Asia that are 3D printing factories. So they're just factories that are filled with 3D printing equipment and post-processing equipment. And whether it's a component or the fully printed shoe, Adidas will work with Carbon, or sometimes they might work directly with the manufacturer if they have their own proprietary design that they just want to go straight to market with. Very often we'll have to, and now I'm speaking in more general terms, but we will have to do some design iterations of like, okay, this is an interesting geometry, but it won't print as well as if you configured it this way. And so there's a back and forth there. We have very often had to design new materials for a product. And so that is a big effort to, qualify the materials, make sure they work in the end use parts and they pass all the necessary tests. But yeah, that's basically that Carbon is our customers are those factories. And so we actually have a subscription model for the printers. So they will lease printers from Carbon. We have chemical suppliers that we have worked with over the years that scale up our resin products. The factories will buy the resins directly from those chemical companies. And then they will make either components, or in this case, fully printed shoes. And then those then go back to Adidas for distribution through their typical sales channel. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not all that different from how they might source a foam component for a shoe. It's just using this new technology, but that's getting in a bit of our business model. But our business model is actually, especially on the consumer product side, we deviated a bit, 3 years ago from let's stop trying to sell people 3D printers and let's start developing applications with companies that will then create opportunities for these factories that will then buy more printers and resin as we scale. And so that's been a big shift in our business model. I think I hit on a few different topics there, but
yeah. I mean, I guess my thought coming into this was ultimately there's a utilization opportunity / challenge. And if you sell Adidas a machine, or Adidas, we'll say it differently, a machine, and they utilize it at 60% just because of how much demand there is for a 3D printed shoe at the moment, then you're missing a trick, right? And so ultimately you will be a better user of that machine if you A, know how to use it, B, know how to continue to evolve, the materials that are going into it and the geometries that are going into it to solve the customer problem, and C, ensure that this thing runs in a dark factory that just requires energy and inputs 24/7. It feels to me like ultimately people, a brand will say we need a thing manufactured, and we're not the specialist. We're a brand company, we're a marketing company, we're a distribution company. We need manufacturers. Are you a manufacturer or not? Oh, no, you still need to do it, or find a company that does. And sure, you might end up with a Foxconn who says, you know what, we're going to buy tons of these machines and aggregate a bunch of this stuff. Great, happy
Right.
days. But until that happens, a Carbon Inc. is basically out saying, we'll do this stuff for you, because if we don't, there's no one out there who wants to destroy their own business model by blowing up the 3D printed, stuff to take out the injection. That kind of where
Yeah,
it
no,
landed.
that's exactly right. And yeah, you're right. Manufacturing is hard, and it greatly helps if our customers are experts in manufacturing and they're buying equipment and materials from us, but we're letting them worry about yield optimization and how to run their factory. That's all on their side. And it's the same. Yeah, exactly. Companies like Adidas and Riddell and Specialized, and these companies that we work with, they are brand companies and they
Right.
work with manufacturers. So that's been a really important shift for us.
Yeah. And like, I know we're going into the meta here, so I apologize, but it's kind of interesting to me. The traditional model of a brand is, this is all too difficult. You should focus on being a brand and come up with product ideas and then have manufacturing partners. In some respects, I imagine a world where these machines get so good, and as you said, the three pillars of the material science and the hardware and the software get so
Yeah.
well integrated, and we
Yeah.
haven't talked about AI yet, and we will, that it ends up being a case of that is no longer the reality for a brand. A brand can actually have this stuff, quote unquote, in house, because it's not. It is a black box, but that black box is kind of a self-contained black box, rather than, well, you have to have 20 different supplier relationships and they'll have to be coordinated.
Yeah.
That's not your core business.
Yeah, I think that is the world we'd like to head to, and that right now there is still a ton of work to do in developing the application, and then we often are critical. We'll have our engineers on site in the factories to hand over the process, get this up and running, and then we are able to sort of let it go. I think and hope eventually more and more of that will be automated, and we will have software tools and automation even within the factories that are running the factories, and that sort of seems to be the trend that the world is heading to. But right now, it is it certainly is a fairly hands-on process that involves a lot of people.
Yeah, and
I
by the
think we're
time it's
heading
plugged into where they operate today, I mean, I'm not going to go into politics, but the US clearly wants more manufacturing to happen in the US. You've got some great technology, and it feels like the materials and the power are both available in the US. The first question most US based people might be asking is, what will it take for this stuff to actually be made here? And as a related problem or thought process, what happens to the places where these things are traditionally manufactured if what you do need is power, access to the machine, and access to the inputs?
Yeah, we are seeing more and more of that, really triggered by all the tariff efforts, that we are seeing more and more companies saying that, well, we want to at least do some portion of the manufacturing in the U.S. Because, depending on how the math comes out, it can be cheaper to actually make something here now, depending on a lot of different factors.
Yeah, and look, I think like there's an economic argument to it as well, but there's also a logistical argument. I'm making a product here in Australia at the moment as a side thing, and 95% of my customers are in Australia, and it's just logistically easier. It's much easier to get the product to them, and they get it in a time frame that feels reasonable. I literally just before this had someone email me and say, "Hey, can you send one to Washington?" I'm like, "Well, I can, and we have, and you will get it, but it'll take 2 weeks." So I'm happy with that. But are you, kind of thing? And so it's not less about are you doing it in the US, but are you doing it where the customers are? And I think
exactly.
the promise of 3D printing has been this idea that we can have a distributed manufacturing base to minimize the amount of stuff that we move around the world, purely for an economic reason. And if those economics start to even out or even get better, then that's a superpower for a brand or for a product or for a company that's embracing that.
Absolutely. Yep.
And then it'd be hard to talk about this without talking about AI and robotics. So I want to just understand like the world looking forward, and it's kind of a two-part question, because I'm always interested when we find amazing innovations on the show to understand why isn't the status quo? Like, what are the barriers? Like, what does the road ahead look like? And I think AI and robotics is probably a big part of where that might be going and what might either solve those problems or be the limiting factor until those things get better in their own right. Help me understand both of those things.
Yeah, well, robotics is probably the easier one where, again, just it's not hard to imagine so-called lights out factories where everything is just automated and you have robotic arms kind of moving printer platforms through various post-processing stages, and just operating all of that in an automated fashion. So yeah, I could get into more of that, but there are many different process steps that we go through, from printing to cleaning the part. We, depending on the resin, we might have a baking step. And so, I think the world is trending towards automating those processes, and we're doing some of our own work in that space as well. On the AI thing, I mean, it's just so broad, it's difficult to give a really concise answer. But I think that there's a few different touch points where I think they're becoming really important. One is in this idea of so-called like generative design. And so, if I want to make something like this, you can imagine inputting, here's what I need this part to do. I need it to have this level of cushioning. I need it to be this weight, and, input it, whatever your parameters are, and having something that spits out an optimized geometry. And we have our own software tool called Design Engine that we sell to our customers that does that. And uses some kind of machine learning type of technology. But you can imagine that getting really, really interesting. And there's whole companies now that are working on sort of, text to CAD type of AI tools, where you just describe what you want and boom, there's your CAD file. And, that's early stages, but I think those types of things are going to integrate perfectly with the types of things that we're doing. Other areas that are sort of getting into AI, I think, in my world, in sort of materials and formulation discovery, we work with a couple of companies in that space. I think the tools are evolving and they're getting better, but they're still not quite at the point where you say, give me a formulation that has these properties and it spits out a perfect formulation, and you just go ahead and manufacture it, and it's going to work. I think that's many, many years away, but certainly possible. And so, it's just such a tough question to answer. We do get asked a lot, but there's just so many. I mean, we obviously use it a ton within the company. There's so many different aspects where I think it could be useful and help accelerate things.
And I mean, look, I think you're right. AI is too broad a thing to say, well, what will AI do? Well, where? Like, which part are we talking about? Because they'll probably act differently. I am interested, and especially given this is your kind of heritage as well, if you think about like, trying to, like, I listen to a lot of the kind of singularity type kind of shows and understanding like where is this all going, and a lot of that's coming out of the valley as well in terms of that thinking and that dialogue. And you have this kind of adage or this kind of phrasing that people are using, which is AI solving X. X might be maths or physics or chemistry or whatever. And the solve for it is anything that can possibly be understood or done within the constraints of what is the physical world. Physics is bounded by some set of laws, and those laws are immutable, and we might not understand them fully today, and there might be laws out there that we think are laws that aren't actually laws, and we have to reinterpret them. But this idea that if you point physics, or in your case, polymer chemistry, and you point AI at it and give it enough compute, it will try all of the possible variations and understand how those things are actually going to turn out. And there may be a constraint. It may not be possible to produce a polymer that produces an effective replica of a titanium product, because you just can't do it. It just literally can't be done. But directionally, that's kind of where you think this stuff may end up, in that AI may be able to go so far down that in the same that we solve a protein folding type challenge, we solve a polymer discovery type challenge.
Yeah, there are certainly people working on it, and there's a lot baked into that. I mean, there are tools that just think about mixtures, and they don't need to understand chemistry. They just know you have these 4 components, and there's pretty old math that can give you a matrix of formulations to try that will then give you a full formulation property space.
Mm-hmm.
My experience, I think that's a long road, and who knows, this space is evolving rapidly, but the tools that we have today are not close to being able to understand the core principles of polymer chemistry and thermodynamics and physics and be able to spit out a perfect formulation. Is it possible? For sure, but we're pretty far away from that with the large language model tools that we have available today, I would say.
Yeah,
not to say that they're not useful, but I think my team's jobs are secure for quite a while.
I would tend to agree. And what's interesting, interesting is probably the wrong word, but what bears pointing out is the things that will make what you're doing successful in the near term, the 3-year, 5-year, even 10 to 15-year horizon, are probably not as focused on solving new polymer challenges, but how do you stitch this whole thing together to make a viable business that allows something to exist today at an economic, point that is viable and comparable?
Or it certainly accelerates. We do a part of what material science is you go into the literature and the patent literature and you look at how other people have approached similar problems, and it can certainly accelerate that discovery process and being able to get answers to questions on sourcing raw materials or just even brainstorming with these tools, I think has proven helpful. But they're pretty far from being able to do the full final job. But it's such a rapidly evolving space. It's hard to predict what's going to happen in any reasonable amount of time.
Awesome. It leads into the last question I'm going to have, but I'm not quite up to the last question. I want to ask a question before I get to that. And we kind of touched on a little bit, but I just think I wouldn't mind going into it a bit more. Like today, in the places where this could be applied really, really well, and you've given a bunch of different examples from cars to sporting to medical. What are the real barriers to carbon ink being widely adopted, like being the status quo for these types of products where this is clearly going to be a better option? Like help me understand your go-to-market and the barriers in front of that.
Yeah, I think one barrier is just what we're doing here is just knowledge and people being aware of that this is possible. And a lot of times we'll meet with people and they go, I had no idea that this was something that could benefit my industry. And so just general awareness and getting the word out on what we're capable of doing. That's one barrier. And I would say maybe the biggest barrier is just this application development process and being able to we have a team of applications engineers. They have a never-ending amount of work coming in of potentially interesting parts and customers, and just being able to more and more quickly go through those, get to an optimal design, get to the right price point, and accelerate that process. I think the more rapidly we can get more products out into the world, and so that's something that we're actively working on: is how do we accelerate that sort of back and forth process of designing parts and showing people what this technology is capable of.
Yeah, and it might have been wrapped in some of the things that you said prior, but I didn't fully get it. I want to make sure. Are you manufacturing stuff for other people, or is your business model at the moment essentially to sell the machine and support them in their use of the machine?
We do a little bit of manufacturing ourselves, but predominantly our customers are doing the actual manufacturing, and we are providing technology in the form of hardware, software, materials to those customers to manufacture parts.
Got it. And services around that, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I ask is that it then means that you, by virtue of that, focus on a particular size in scale, maturity of customer for whom that's even possible.
But it's a pretty broad range. I mean, we have some customers that make, as I mentioned, millions of parts per year, and some customers that might make a few thousand. And so, it highly depends on the industry and the type of part. But that's another big example of why a flexible manufacturing technology like 3D printing is beneficial, is because you're able to service both the low volume, high value markets, and also some of the, higher volume, maybe moderately valued type of parts.
Yeah, assuming the machine doesn't cost $20 million.
Right. Which
we didn't talk about price. All right, cool. I have a closing question, which I always kind of ask, and it kind of rounds it all out. And I'll ask in this order specifically. I want to understand your least favorite part of working on this problem, and your favorite part of working on this problem, so we can finish on a positive note.
Yeah, that sounds good. Least favorite part, I would say, is probably dealing with various regulatory agencies. And there's just lots of paperwork and lots of rules and lots of things that need to be registered and finalized. And a lot of it has good intention, but it can be a real strain on innovation and the pace of things.
What are those regulations typically about? Sorry, like in terms of
so if we make a new material, it has to be registered with, in the US, it would be EPA, and in Europe, it would be REACH. And really every country that we want to ship material to, we have to register these components. And it's just, it's a lot of paperwork. And
that's related to the plastic itself, the polymer, not the product that you're making with it. Interesting.
Yeah. And then there's also that too. And so we have some FDA regulated products in the dental space and medical space. And again, it's all for good reason. I understand the need for it, but it's not my favorate part of the job.
Sure.
Yeah. But it
was like going back to university and doing your PhD.
Yeah, exactly. My favorite part of the job is, I think I mentioned it earlier, it's just the vast diversity and scope of products and customers that we have. And so you could have a medical device company come in one day, and then you have an apparel company coming in another day, and then, I don't know, the company making tractors come in the following day. And it's just, no matter, there's almost no industry that can't benefit from what we're doing. And I just love that about it. It's very, keep you very knowledgeable about a lot of different things.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, like, as you were saying that, I was thinking about mates of mine who, I went through finance. I didn't finish the degree, but they did, and they all went into corporate advisory work. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what we do is incredibly boring and repetitive in terms of we go in, find a company, do something financial engineering to it, and then offload it. But to be able to do that, we have to fully understand the industry. We have to understand how they make money, everything about it, so that we can effectively do that. And that bit's actually really, really interesting, which seems to have parallels to what you're referring to.
Very similar. Yeah.
That's amazing. Awesome, Jason. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was really fascinating. I actually have a lot more questions, but I have been trying to do better to keep the format to about an hour, and we typically go over anyway.
I appreciate that.
I'm sure there's actually a bunch of other interviews with you that I had checked out as well. So for people who want to find out more, I'd actually recommend going and checking out some of the other interviews as well. And there's tons and tons at your website around what you guys do and how you do it. And like, there's a lot of rabbit holes to go down there. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope it was beneficial for you, and look forward to seeing how you guys crush it in the years ahead.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. And just to say it, that website is carbon3d.com.
Beautiful.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.